Hope you guys have a good day going on here on this Monday. Anyway, we're going to be getting on with this Fire Warrior Strike Team build. It should be a couple-hour broadcast today. We're going to be listening to some audio books, so kind of hanging out, and just sit back and hope you guys enjoy hanging out here.
Helian Rain by George Mann, performed by Toby Longworth. Amongst the ruination of the ancient scriptorium, a statue of white marble was stirring. Tentatively, the figure came to life, shifting its position to better observe the courtyard on the other side of the broken balustrade. It moved with a practiced silence, resting the nose of its bolt pistol on a fragment of the shattered stairwell, its jaw set firm with grim determination. High above, through the canopy of cracked beams and smashed roof tiles, birds wheeled in an empty sky, punctuated only by the distant heat trails of drop pods bombarding the grassy savannas to the east. The place was shrouded in an eerie cloak of stillness, as if the building itself was somehow holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. Veteran Sergeant Gravis of the Raven Guard peered around the debris with eyes of pure obsidian, his pale skin stark against the surrounding stonework. The alien was barely visible, even with his augmented senses. Only the occasional alteration in the quality of light or the ghost of movement betrayed its presence in the courtyard at all. He wasn't yet sure if the creature had noticed him, or whether it was toying with him, waiting for him to make his move. Gravis turned his head, slowly, searching for any sign of his scouts. Nothing. He smiled. They were learning. Gravis returned his attention to the courtyard. His finger tensed on the trigger of his weapon. Just a second longer. It moved again. He depressed the trigger, spraying a round of hot bolter fire across the flank of the concealed beast. What followed happened in a blur of movement so swift and so precise that Gravis was almost caught off guard. The tyrannid creature emitted a tortured howl, spinning around with surprising agility and leaping over a ruined wall towards its attacker. Gravis could see now that his instincts had been correct. The thing was a lictor, 3 meters tall, with a hard, pink, chitinous shell and a festering mouth filled with wriggling, writhing probosces. Its eyes gleamed an angry red, and 2 immense, bony blades scythed the air above it, the ferocious tips of extra limbs that jutted from its shoulders. Its ribcage was covered in a series of angular barbs that Gravis knew, from experience, were to be avoided at all costs. And it smelled like death. Like the very essence of death itself. It was a scent that Gravis would never forget. Altheon 4 would be burned in his memory forever. The creature raised its head towards the sky and howled once again, before stalking forward with menacing intent. It was then that the scriptorium erupted into a cacophony of sound and movement. The report of a shotgun, the chatter of bolters, the sound of boots crunching gravel, the ominous clacking of the lictor's hooves against the broken flagstones. Where previously the only sounds had been the distant cawing of the birds, now the ruined building was filled with the riot of battle. The scouts materialized from the shadows like ghosts stepping between the fabric of worlds. Grey camo cloaks billowing around their shoulders, weapons charged and ready, prepared as always for the battle to come. Gravis backed away from the lictor as the others swarmed around it, encircling it, trapping it between them with an ease and discipline that made Gravis's heart sing. Gravis squeezed the trigger of his bolt pistol again, loosing a hail of shots. The lictor thrashed around, unsure in which direction to focus its attack. Gravis offered suppressing fire as Tyrus leapt forward, lopping off one of the lictor's bony limbs with a single easy movement of his combat knife. Green ichor gushed from the wound as the arm fell twitching to the ground. Tyrus fell back to avoid the slashing talon from somewhere above that threatened to decapitate him in retaliation.
Concentrate your fire on its head.
Gravis strode forward, raising his weapon and firing directly into the nest of tentacles that swarmed around the monster's gaping mouth. The lictor screeched in defiance. It lashed out to the left, catching Corbus hard with a flick of its remaining clawed arm, sending him sprawling to the floor, his shotgun spitting wildly into the sky as his aim was knocked askew. He rolled across the flagstones and remained there on the ground, still, his face hidden from view.
Bring it down before he can call for more of its kind.
Gravis moved to the left, trying to close the gap in the circle left by the prone Corbus, all the while keeping his black eyes fixed on the beast, his weapon trained on its head. It wouldn't do to offer the monster an escape route. Lictors hunted alone, but their kind were never far behind, and if they didn't bring it down swiftly, its pheromones would bring swarms of the things down on them. There was a cry from behind the lictor. Avin or Shield. Gravis couldn't see which, but he could see the creature's barbed tail flick up over its shoulder, blood dripping from the bony protrusions that crested its tip. Another one down. Gravis felt something thunk into his chest plate and cursed for allowing himself to be distracted. He looked down in horror to see one of the lictor's flesh barbs had embedded itself in his armor. Extruded from the alien's chest, the barb was attached to a glistening tendril of thick, ropey flesh. The lictor jerked and Gravis lurched forward, only just managing to retain his footing. The creature was drawing him in, pulling the tendril back inside itself and dragging him closer in the process. Its slavering probosces, or at least those that still remained after the rounds of bolter fire that Gravis had shot into its face, quivered with anticipation. This is what he had seen on Altheon 4, the horror of what those tendrils could do. He wouldn't let it happen to him. Gravis dropped his bolt pistol and kicked backwards, allowing his feet to come up off the ground and throwing all of his weight against the drag of the lictor's tendril. The barb held, and although the Xenos staggered, it remained firm. It continued to pull Gravis closer. Gravis took a deep breath. His next move was all about timing. Around him, the other scouts were still pounding the lictor with bolter fire and swipes from their combat knives, and he could see it was close to death. Syrupy ichor ran from numerous wounds in its torso, and the air was filled with the stench of scorched bone and seared flesh. But the creature's eyes still burned with fury, and he knew that it would not stop. Not until it had burrowed its loathsome bone-tipped probes inside his head and stolen his memories, absorbed all of his thoughts. Death was one thing, a thing he would welcome when the time came, and he knew he had proved himself to the Emperor. But this alien, this monster, it represented something else. The loss of everything he was. He would not allow this creature inside his head. Gravis's feet skittered across the shattered floor of the scriptorium. The creature was close now, so close he could feel the heat of its fetid breath. He flexed his shoulders, readied himself. Then, in one swift movement, he reached up and clasped the grip of his chainsword, tearing it free from its scabbard and thumbing the activation stud. He swung it round before him, at the same time allowing his body to go limp, foregoing all resistance so that he was pulled sharply forward towards the straining lictor. He collided with it, caught for a moment in its bony embrace. For a moment he thought he saw a flicker of triumph in the alien's eyes as it readied itself to feast on his mind, before it realized the chainsword was buried to the hilt in its chest, thrumming with power, wedged there by the force of its own trap. The lictor screamed as Gravis forced the chainsword up and out of its torso, ripping through organs and muscles and bones until, at last, the roaring blade burst free, slicing unceremoniously through its neck and finally silencing it forever. The alien wavered for a moment before toppling to one side, Gravis still tangled in a heap of limbs beneath it.
Get me out of here!
He barked at the others, who still stood in a circle around the dead beast, looking on with something approaching awe. Sometimes, in the stillness, the quiet moments of anticipation before a battle, he thought of deliverance. He remembered the clusters of smouldering venting towers erupting from the moon's surface like bristling spines, puncturing the grey regolith to belch oily fumes into the midnight sky. He recalled the constant rumbling beneath his feet, the reverberations of subterranean mining engines, coring out the centre of the tiny world, harvesting minerals to feed the scores of ever-hungry forges and manufactories. He saw the dark, towering monolith of the Raven Spire, silhouetted against the planet light of distant Kievar, and thought of home. He hadn't returned to Deliverance for nearly a century, drawn instead by the constant need to protect these outer worlds on the fringes of the Imperium. Or, he smiled grimly, to protect the local human forces from their own incompetence. Perhaps, in truth, there was more to it than that. Perhaps something else was keeping him away. He buried the thought. Idos was a backwater, a long way from that half-remembered home. A world infested with the stink of Xenos, fodder for the enemy spawning pools. Yet Idos had been granted the Emperor's protection, and the Raven Guard were there to ensure that it was enforced. And besides, any opportunity to halt the advance of a Tyranid hive fleet was an opportunity worth taking. He'd fought Tyranids before, back on Altheon IV, and he knew them for the zealous abominations they were, a scourge that needed to be purged. They had infested the galaxy and obliterated innumerable worlds with their insatiable appetite for the raw materials from which they reproduced. They would absorb the biomass of their enemies, remolding their constituent parts into new alien paradigms. Yet the Tyranids were an enemy that he could understand. Their motives were simple, their strategy pure. They wished only to feast on the biomass of a world, to consume it completely, and they would take it through weight of numbers alone, single-minded and devastating. Shadow Captain Aramis Corrin surveyed the ruined landscape before him, the grassy plains covered in straw-like grass, the undulating hills and ridges that formed from the shattered wreckage of Proxima City in the distance. It was too late for this place. He knew that already, an indisputable truth. His Raven Guard would halt the flow of the Xenos, but the planet itself would never recover. Too much had been lost, and the world was far too out on the rim of the Imperium for it to be worthy of rebuilding. The planet's inhabitants knew that too, and that's what had driven them to such desperate measures, using inferior weapons to attempt to destroy the hive ship that hung in planetary orbit, a moon-sized abomination. Their targeting had been off, however, and instead they had inadvertently destroyed their own moon, Helion, splintering the worldlet into a billion fragments that now racked Idos below with fierce meteor storms and gravitational instability. And all the while, the Xenos kept on coming, an insatiable maw devouring the planet. Corrin looked down upon the serried ranks of space marines, their black armor gleaming in the morning sunlight. To his left, bike squadrons formed a protective flank, covering the line of trees in case anything emerged unexpectedly from the forest. To his right, assault squads readied themselves for the coming onslaught, their talons glinting. And between them stood the main bulk of the Fourth Company, bolters at the ready. The Raven Guard were few, but they would hold firm. This, to Corrin, was yet another indisputable truth. Corrin himself stood upon the crest of a hill, resplendent in his ancient armor. It was an antique, worn for millennia by the captains of the Fourth Company. Created in the Martian forges before the time of the Great Heresy, it was engraved with the names of all those who had worn it before, had given their lives in honor to the Emperor. A litany for his dead brethren, covering every inch of its pitted black surface. Corrin felt the burden of their memory, but also the honor of their company, the pedigree from which he had come. Today he would make his forebears proud. He would honor their memory. And one day his name would be added to theirs, etched onto a pauldron or a leg plate or an arm brace. One day he would give his life in the service of his emperor, and it would be glorious. The thought gave him much comfort. Corin flexed his shoulders. On the horizon he could see the alien swarm approaching, a hazy cloud of buzzing wings, slashing limbs and putrid, slavering jaws. Behind the flared respirator of his helmet, he smiled. Soon his talons would taste alien blood. Gravis kneeled beside Corbis, rolling the young scout over onto his back to check for any signs of life. Behind him, the corpse of the lictor still quivered nervously in its final death throes. Corbis was tall but stocky, with a square jaw and a long, puckered scar running across his cheek from his left eye to his ear. His flesh was already beginning to lose its pinkish hue, becoming pale and translucent, and his hair had darkened to the color of dusk, a sign that his melanchromic organ was mutating. He had the mark of the raven. Gravis's flesh had long since been bleached by time and experience. His eyes, too, had lost their color, becoming orbs of the purest black, glossy pools of impenetrable darkness. He was older than the others and had seen combat in all its multifarious facets, fought Xenos and traitors alike on myriad worlds throughout the Imperium. It was his role to train the fresh-faced scouts, to shape them into fully fledged battle brothers, if they managed to survive their training. And Idos was no simple exercise. The enemy was lurking around every corner. Gravis stood, his boots crunching on the splintered flagstones.
He's breathing.
He walked over to where Tyrus and Avin were standing over the prone form of Shyle, stooping to reclaim his bolt pistol from where he dropped it during the fight. His exposed arms were covered in lacerations and scars, as...
Yeah, sorry, I just want to stop the show real quick. Yeah, so once again, man, I don't know what is up with this Games Workshop, but here's again the mount area for the scope or whatever for this rifle on these towel. Anyway, look, it's broke. So we're going to put this one aside. Not a big deal. I mean, it's just a little whatever. It's going to happen, but it's just happened too often. Anyway, back to the book, guys. Welcome, Ghetto Finger Paints. Thanks for hanging out.
as well as ichor and bodily fluids spilled from the chest of the lictor when he had brought it down.
He's dead, Sergeant.
Tyrus said, without turning his head away from the body of his fallen brother. Graves glanced at the corpse. He most certainly was. Half of his face was missing from where the lictor's whip-like tail had caught him beneath the chin, crushing his jaw and pulping his right eye socket at the same time. His other eye remained open, as if staring expectantly at Tyrus, willing him to do something more. Dark blood was seeping out over the grey stone floor, forming glossy pools in the midday sun.
He was probably dead before he hit the ground.
Graves dropped to his haunches beside the body. Shile's camo cloak was wrapped around his fallen body like some sort of funerary shroud. Graves pulled it back to reveal the black armor beneath. The scout's belt was adorned with the skulls of Kiervarian ravens, tiny yellowing heads with long curved beaks, tied in a little cluster to a thin silver chain. These totems, these corvaya, were tokens of honor and skill. They were a representation of the raven spirit and a symbol of their homeworld. They were a measure of the scout's aptitude and stealth, a part of the initiation rites through which Shyle had given himself over to the Emperor to become an Astartes. Each initiate would prove their cunning by catching these birds in the great woodlands of Kievar, moving so silently amongst the lush flora that they could grab the avian where it perched, taking it with their bare hands and gently breaking its neck. It took months of practice and great skill to be light enough on their feet and swift enough in their movements to grab the bird before it fluttered away. Graves cupped the bundle of tiny skulls in his fist and pulled them free of the dead Space Marine's belt. He looked up at the others.
Who will carry his corvaya?
Tyrus stepped forward.
I would be honored, Sergeant.
Graves gave a swift, sharp nod and handed the totems over to the other scout.
Then remember that you carry with you his honor also. He will rest when you return them to the soil from whence they came.
The others waited in silence while Tyrus affixed the skulls to his belt beside his own. Graves turned to see Corbus climbing to his feet, rubbing his neck.
You took your time.
Without warning, the vox bead in his ear sputtered to life with a hissing burst of static.
Sergeant Gravis.
Captain Corrin.
State your position, Sergeant.
We're on the eastern fringe of the city, Captain. Approximately 10 kilometers from the main engagement, just inside the Administratum complex.
The vox went silent for a moment.
Captain?
When he spoke again, Corrin sounded distracted.
Gravis, there's a power station 3 kilometers north of your position. I need you to destroy it.
Gravis frowned.
Destroy it?
Yes, and don't leave anything standing. Cause the biggest explosion you can.
But we don't have any explosives, Captain.
Then be creative, Brother Gravis.
Yes, Captain.
And Sergeant,
Captain?
be swift.
The link went dead. Gravis pulled his auspex from his belt and consulted the readout. 3 kilometers of rubble and wreckage stood between them and the power station, not to mention the risk of lurking enemy and ripper swarms mopping up the dead. And he had no idea how they were going to destroy a power station with only bolt pistols and combat knives. It would be a test of their mettle, and a test of his training. Gravis glanced up at the expectant faces of his scouts.
Our mission parameters have changed,
he said, unable to contain the wide grin that was now splitting his face. The enemy swarm was more substantial than even the reports of his own scouts had led him to believe. There were thousands of them, a great shifting ocean of flesh and bone. Corrin watched from his place on the hillside as the oncoming tide of Xenos swarmed in towards his Raven Guard, immovable, holding firm in the face of untenable opposition. The noise was incredible. The chatter of bolter fire, the pounding of feet and hooves, the rending of plasteel and metal, the screeching of the Xenos as they fell in waves. Heavy bolters punched the air somewhere behind Corrin, sending rounds whistling into the howling aliens below. The bite squads roared to life, churning the earth as they shot into the melee, bolter rounds spitting from their forward-facing emplacements, mowing down scores of Tyranids as they plowed through the chaotic ranks of the enemy army. To the right, talons flashed as the assault squads pinned the enemy's left flank, slicing through the mass of darting Hormagaunts and Termagants that clambered over one another to get at the Marines. And, in the distance, like an eye at the center of a vast storm, the Hive Tyrant. It was immense, an abomination rendered flesh. Its great crested head towered high above the rest of its kin, swaying from left to right, taking in the enemy positions. Its huge cannon belched fat gobbets of venom that scorched the earth where they fell. Its limbs terminated in long, scything blades that cleaved the air around it, hungry for the blood of its enemies. It carried itself with an air of intelligence uncommon to the other, more animalistic creatures that surrounded it. The captain knew that this creature, this monster, was the node that held the aliens together, the conduit by which the orbiting hive ship organized its troops, ensuring the mindless individuals of the swarm were not, in their multitudes, mindless at all. They were a gestalt, one organism formed out of many. But if Corrin could sever that link between them, could interrupt that flow of information from the central intelligence above, then they became nothing. They would lose their cohesion. They would lose their purpose. And an enemy without purpose was no enemy at all. Corrin turned to see one of his veterans approaching, his ebon armor scarred by the marks of 1,000 prior battles.
Argus, it is time for us to join our brothers in the fray.
Corrin could not read Argus's expression behind his faceplate, but there was hesitation in his voice when he spoke.
Captain, we are few. The enemy are legion. We cannot withstand a full engagement with the Xenos if the battle becomes protracted.
He let his words hang for a moment.
As keen as I am to spill their foul blood, this is not our way.
Corrin nodded.
I hear your concerns, brother. But we must have faith. The Raven Guard will triumph this day.
Corrin knew he was taking an enormous gamble, playing a dangerous game. But that was their way. They would not defeat this enemy through brute force alone. They would outthink it. They would lead it into a trap. It was up to Gravis now.
Watch the skies, Captain!
Corin turned at Argis's cry to see two winged gargoyles sweeping out of the sky towards him, their fangs chattering insanely, jaws dripping with venom. Their heads and backs were plated with the same pink armor as their larger, flightless kin. But their exposed bellies were soft and fleshy, the perfect target. Corin tested his lightning talons. They fizzed and crackled with energy. He held his ground, waiting as the creatures swooped closer. He became aware of the sputter of bolter fire as others around him began firing indiscriminately into the gargoyle flock, which suddenly filled the sky in all directions. He heard the beating of 100 leathery wings as the hillside was cast in deep shadow, the density of the baying flock momentarily blotting out the sun. Swathes of the creatures tumbled from the air like fleshy missiles, shredded by bolter fire, colliding noisily with the ground at the Space Marine's feet. But the onslaught continued unabated. Corin kept his eyes trained on the two gargoyles approaching him from above. The beast on the left squeezed the trigger of its strange, bone-colored weapon, spitting a fine spray of acid across the captain's chest plate and pauldron. He ignored it, remaining perfectly motionless as the venom chewed tiny holes in his armor. He dismissed the warning sigils that flared up angrily inside his helmet. Waiting. The gargoyles maneuvered themselves in for the kill, swinging around to offer their vicious-looking tail barbs to the Space Marine, aiming their poison-spewing weapons at his faceplate. Still waiting. Corin pounced. He leapt into the air, twisting his body and uncoiling like a tightly wound spring. He extended his talons skywards, skewering the gargoyles through their exposed bellies, impaling one on each of his sparking fists. His maneuver was timed to perfection. The gargoyles had no time to react, screeching in pain and fury, twisting on the hissing metal claws that now punctured their pink, alien flesh. Pungent ichor coursed down Corin's arms. He landed neatly, his fists still held aloft, as if brandishing the splayed gargoyles like obscene trophies. They thrashed for a few seconds more, their wings beating his arms and his face, their claws scrabbling at his power armor, before falling still, nothing but dead weights. Corin roared in triumph and lowered his arms, casting the twin corpses to the ground. His ire was up. Below, his Astartes were holding the line, keeping the aliens back, refusing to buckle. But Corin could see them straining against the sheer numbers and the zealous ferocity of the Tyranid assault. It was time. There was nothing more he could do from his vantage point on the hillside. He had committed the Raven Guard to this course of action, and if he failed, then it would be a glorious death. All that was left was to hold the line. All that was left was the battle. Corin charged down the hillside, his boots pounding the earth as he ran. He leapt into the fray, his weapons ready. The blood sang in his veins. This was why he had been created, what he was made for. This, the glory of battle. This, the smiting of the Emperor's foes. This, the great war against the enemies of man. This was his purpose, his entire reason for being. Corin allowed the hunger for battle to consume him, gave himself utterly to the fight. He became one with his flashing talons. He danced and parried, transforming himself into a whirling dervish of death amidst a sea of pink flesh and chitin. Xenos fell in his wake. He carved through them like a spirit passing through walls of solid rock, his talons spitting and humming as they cleaved skulls and separated limbs from torsos. His ancient ebon armor glistened with alien blood. He dragged the air into his lungs and bellowed as he fought, "Victorus aut mortis!" The aliens came at him in a relentless tide, but he cut them down. He would hold the line. Gravis would prevail. Gravis studied the hololithic readout of his auspex and glanced warily up at the sky. It had taken the scouts over half an hour to pick their way through the rubble of the Administratum building and now a fresh meteor storm was on the horizon, threatening their progress. He could see fragments of planetary debris beginning to burn up in the upper atmosphere, leaving long, fiery streaks across the sky in their wake. The storms had plagued the Raven Guard's campaign ever since their arrival on Idos. Rocks and boulders hurtling indiscriminately out of the sky at incredible velocities. A terrible, deadly rain. Helium rain. A high-pitched whistling sound pierced the air. Gravis tracked the trajectory of a fist-sized rock as it smashed into the outcropping of a nearby building. The masonry exploded with a deafening echo of stone striking stone. This was followed by another, then another, fragments of the former moon clattering amongst the ruins with the explosive force of successive heavy bolter rounds.
Incoming, Sergeant!
Gravis turned to see a hail of debris showering out of the fire-streaked sky all around them. Tiny stones pinged off his carapace. A larger piece struck his right arm brace, nearly knocking him from his feet. Another tore a deep gash in his exposed forearm. The blood looked startlingly bright against the wintry paleness of his flesh.
Take cover!
He called to the others, scrambling for the nearest building. The others scattered. Corbis fell in behind Gravis, running over to share the shelter of an immense arched doorway. Much of the building had been destroyed, and Gravis knew that what remained of it would be little help when faced with a major impact. But it would offer some protection from the hailstorm. If they were lucky, the larger strikes would occur further afield. Gravis heaved a frustrated sigh. They would have to wait for the storm to pass. This was one enemy that neither their bolt pistols nor their cunning could placate. The meteor storm swept in, bombarding the city, pummeling what remained of the buildings and reducing much of it to heaps of rockcrete and stone. Gravis dropped to his haunches, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the impacts and the larger collisions elsewhere in the city.
You fought them before, Sergeant?
Gravis tore his eyes away from the hailstorm ravaging the city, glancing back at Corbis, who was regarding him with interest, leaning against a fragment of broken pillar, his shotgun clutched in his hands. Gravis nodded.
Alphian 4. We were ambushed. Most of my squad were killed. We were inside the hive when they came out of the darkness and hit us, attacking with all the fury of the warp itself. Terrible, deadly things with 4 arms. Until then, I'd assumed that Tyranids were nothing but beasts, animals that lacked any real intelligence. A pestilence that infested human worlds because it didn't know any different.
Alright folks, what's up? This is Ghetto Finger here.
things,
Welcome to Ghetto Finger Paints, guys.
Gene
We got the
stealers.
Teu Strike Team Fire Warriors fully
A
complete
keen
now.
intelligence.
We'll have to add a
that
few
spoke
more
of
bits,
something else.
antennas, grenades,
Corbis
so on and
was
so
watching
forth,
him
little bits
keenly.
to 'em and stuff, get them primed up
How did you survive
and ready for paint.
when so many others
So I
fell?
appreciate everybody coming out and hanging
Gravis
out with us
stiffened.
here. And we'll go ahead and kill out the rest of this story here. It's about 30 or so minutes left, about 40 minutes. And that's it for you guys. Thanks for hanging out with us here. And make sure you give us a follow over on Facebook. Thank you.
He heard no accusation in Corbis's gruff tone, but the questions and the memories stirred feelings of guilt within him. He could not explain why he had lived when so many of his brothers had died.
I cannot say. I was blinded by rage. I killed 5, 6 of the creatures, tearing them apart with my bolter and my fist. My brothers had wounded many of them before they had fallen, but my hatred spurred me on. I covered my armor with their blood. Then one of them caught me in the shoulder with its claws, splitting my armor like a tin can. I was on my back. The thing was on top of me, its sickening jaws dripping toxins, its hot breath fogging my helm. I prepared myself. I was ready to die alongside my brothers. I had fought well and made my peace with the Emperor. And then a sudden burst of bolter fire, and the creature was dead, shredded by explosive rounds. Erinis had saved my life. He was dead when I got to him, disemboweled and lying in a pool of his own blood. One other, Argis, was injured but alive. I carried him back to our base.
Corbis nodded gravely.
What happened?
Gravis studied the scout's face. He was young and had not yet witnessed a campaign on the scale of Alphian 4. He did not know of the necessary lengths they would go to protect the Imperium from its enemies.
We destroyed the hive. It was lost. We were too late. And too few. The entire hive.
Gravis nodded.
And now we are here.
He turned his head to watch the hailstorm showering the street outside.
And so are those stinking Xenos. This time, the Raven Guard will have their revenge.
Gravis jerked suddenly and let off a series of short, sharp shots with his bolt pistol. There was a soft thump amongst the clatter of meteors as something fell dead to the ground nearby. Gravis rose slowly from his crouching position, tracking his weapon back and forth across the street.
Be ready, Corbis. Those things don't hunt alone.
What were... Corbis fell silent as a small tyrannid creature about the size of a large dog hopped up onto a slab of fallen masonry just in front of him. Tiny meteor rocks were pinging off its armored plating, but the creature seemed unaffected by the constant pummeling from above. It turned and hissed at the scout, baring its fangs and its long, curling tongue. It held a bone-colored gun of some sort in its bony claws. It cocked its head and moved as if about to strike. Corbis squeezed the trigger of his shotgun and took the creature's head clean off. The stench of burnt meat filled the air around them as the body slumped soundlessly to the ground. Gravis stepped out into the street and released a volley of bolter rounds into the storm. He could see a pack of termagants swarming through the wreckage towards him, their heads bobbing as they ran, twitching as the debris from the shattered moon continued to stream down around them. He knew that they would not be alone. If there were termagants here, experience told him that there would be bigger and more ferocious Tyrannid warriors just behind them. Gravis waved for the scouts to join him as he unleashed another round of bolts into the oncoming mass of aliens. Bodies shuddered and fell, but more swarmed over the top of their dead kin, drawing closer. Gravis felt the sting of tiny stones puncturing his flesh, burying themselves in his exposed arms and cheeks. Bright red blood began to course freely over his pale flesh. Behind him, Corbis was crouching with his shotgun balanced on some fallen masonry, picking off termagants one at a time. The other scouts emerged from their shelter too, following suit, dropping aliens with every shot. A lucky blast of return fire from one of the termagants caught Avil full in the chest, bowling him backwards. Gravis heard him cry out as he fought at whatever it was that had struck him, and was now attempting to burrow its way through his carapace armor. There was no time to help him. The sergeant raised his bolt pistol again, searching for another target. And then he was being pitched forward, the sound of a massive impact ringing loudly in his ears. The ground shook violently beneath him. Darkness swam at the edges of his vision. His last thought before the black cowl of unconsciousness swallowed him entirely was that they needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. The battle raged with a fierce intensity. Corin was surrounded by a sea of flashing claws, creatures scrabbling to climb over his power armor, striking him as they tried to get at the space marine inside. He fought them off with ease, carried along by his fury, swept up in a tide of death. His talons hummed and spat with electrical energy as he cut a swathe through the mass of pink flesh and bone. He heard more than felt the meteor storm as the hail of tiny stones rained down on his armor, scoring the black ceramite where it fell. Further afield, boulders hurtled out of the sky, decimating the clashing armies, tearing great furrows and ridges in the landscape. Impact craters formed huge pockmarks across the battlefield, and chaotic piles of the dead lay all around them. Aliens and Raven Guard alike swallowed indiscriminately in the waves of earth that rushed out from the site of each strike. Above, the sky looked as if it were on fire. Corin twisted sharply to the right, swinging his talons up to spear a Hormagaunt through the head. He gave his wrist a quick jerk, and the creature's face came away in a spray of sickly ichor. Its twitching body fell to the ground, but Corin had no time to savor the moment. For every alien he killed, another two took its place. The Vox bead buzzed suddenly to life in his ear.
Captain.
Corin grunted. The sound of another voice pulled him momentarily from the trance of the battle.
Go ahead, Phoebus.
We're ready, Captain.
Corin grinned inside his helm, striking down another Hormagaunt with a swipe of his twin lightning claws.
Your timing couldn't be better, brother. Mount your attack, and may the Emperor be with you.
The Vox crackled and went dead. Corin spun, arcing round to catch another of the beasts that had managed to get behind him. He jabbed his fists through the Hormagaunt's torso, pulling them apart to splay the creature open, spilling its organs in a bloody heap. The ground shook as another massive meteor struck from above, gouging the landscape, ripping an immense furrow across the battlefield. Scores of aliens died in its wake, buried in the accompanying deluge of mud and loam. Corin glanced up. The Raven Guard were still showering the Tyranid army with heavy bolter shells and plasma grenades, but many of them were being thrown off course as they collided with the meteors that filled the sky, exploding in mid-air before reaching their targets. He looked to the left. It was difficult to see through the tangle of grappling limbs, but the bike squads had now closed on the left flank of the Tyranid army, closing off their escape route through the trees. Corin laughed as he turned his attention back to the swarm of aliens, freeing his arm from the grip of a Hormagaunt that was trying to scrabble up and over his leg. He crushed its skull in his fist. His plan was working. With Phoebus closing in on the Xenos army from behind, flanking them with a Raven Guard force comparable in size to the one under Corin's direct command, they had the Xenos pinned. To the right, like the walls of a great dam, were the walls of the ruined city. The Tyranids were completely surrounded. Now, it was a waiting game. All they had to do was hold the line. Corin willed Gravis to hurry. Light bloomed before his eyes. Light and the sound of raindrops striking the ground. A relentless pitter-patter, pitter-patter. Gravis coughed and heaved himself up off the ground. He shook his head to clear the woolliness. The sound wasn't rain. It was tiny stones. It was helium. The memories flooded back into his consciousness. The meteor storm was still pounding the city. He couldn't have been out for long. He cast around, looking for his bolt pistol. He found it jutting out from beneath a pile of rubble and retrieved it, dusting it off. He stretched and felt a long gash on his left cheek tug uncomfortably. The flesh had already begun to knit itself back together, but his face was crusted with dry blood. Smaller wounds covered his arms like a spider's web or a chaotic street map. The scene all around Gravis was one of utter devastation. Behind him, a large boulder had slammed into the street, toppling a basilica. The building's metal substructure had buckled and warped, and it now described a twisted skeleton against the sky, having shed its rock-crete skin. The ground itself had risen in a vast wave from where the meteor had struck, ruffling the earth like a rug pulled out from somewhere deep beneath the city. Steam rose from the impact crater like so many ethereal spirits desperate to return to the warp. And all the while, the meteors continued to fall, stinging Gravis's already battered flesh. Gravis realized he had been flung out over the lip of the crater during the impact. He began searching the immediate area for the other scouts, but found only dead termagants, their weak bodies crushed by the wreckage of the building or shattered by the force of the impact. One of them was still squirming, its back legs clawing pathetically at the exposed soil. It made a high-pitched mewling sound as he approached, and then hissed viciously as he stood over it, turning its lolling head with the edge of his boot. He put a bolt through its skull, not out of any sense of mercy, but simply to ensure it was dead.
Sergeant?
He heard the call from over the other side of the crater and ran over to find Corbis crouched over the dead figure of Avil. The scout's body was covered in a fine layer of grit and stone, and Corbis was brushing it away with his hand, searching for Avil's corvia. He located the tiny bird skulls, and Gravis watched him tug them free, fixing them carefully to his own belt in tribute to his dead brother.
Was it the blast?
Corbis shook his head.
It was the Xenos.
He indicated a hole in Avil's armor, where a termagant's living ammunition had bored a hole through to the scout's chest, devouring his hearts.
Where's Tyrus?
Down there.
Corbis nodded behind him. Gravis started over, increasing his pace to a run when he heard a spray of bolter fire coming from that same direction, fearful that the scout had engaged the enemy. He crested a large mound of earth to discover Tyrus was, in fact, following his lead, quickly and effectively terminating any remaining aliens he found amongst the wreckage. He looked up when he noticed Gravis watching.
Abel is dead. We have a mission to complete.
The statement was matter-of-fact, pointed. The authority behind it was implicit. Tyrus nodded. Gravis could see the scout's knuckles were white where he clenched his bolt pistol hard in his grip. He was feeling the loss of his brothers keenly. Gravis smiled grimly. Tyrus would have his chance to avenge the dead, and so would he. The power station loomed out of the hailstorm like a jagged tooth. A towering edifice of pipework and fuel vats that spewed a constant stream of oily smoke into the sky for miles in every direction. This was the generatorium, until recently the power hub for an entire quadrant of the city. Whatever else had become of the metropolis, however, this Leviathan was still operational. Or, at least, Gravis considered as they approached through the wide, ruined street, something was keeping it running. Gravis and the two remaining scouts ran through the pummeling rain towards their goal. Time was running out. It had been hours since their last communication from the captain. Many of those hours lost to the meteor storm and their encounter with the termagants. Now was the time to act. Gravis scanned the approach to the generatorium before ushering the others forward. He clipped his auspex to his belt and reached for his chainsword. He didn't know what to expect inside the building, but he wasn't about to be caught unawares. Tyrus was first to approach the large, arched doorway. He stepped cautiously through the entrance, his bolt pistol held before him at arm's length. A moment later he reappeared, indicating that the others should follow. Gravis and Corbus kept their backs to the wall as they moved slowly around the doorway to join Tyrus inside. The corridor beyond the door was dank and industrial. Bare metal plating covered the walls and floor. Exposed pipes wormed their way through the passageways like a network of arteries and veins. It was dimly lit, with only flickering emergency beacons to guide them. The stench of oil and burning coal was almost palpable. Gravis motioned for the others to be silent. He listened for a moment, trying to discern any indication of movement. There was nothing but the noise of a dripping pipe, echoing through the empty corridor. That and the continuous background sounds of the meteor storm striking the building outside. He looked up, meeting the eyes of the others. They were injured and bedraggled, but their eyes shone with a burning intensity.
We need to find the reactor. That's the only way we can destroy this place without any explosives. We set it to overload, and we get out of here as quickly as possible.
Corbus straightened his back and flexed the fibrous muscles in his neck.
May the Emperor protect us. We will do our duty.
They set off down the passageway, their boots ringing loudly on the metal floor plates. They passed along a series of almost identical corridors as they wound their way towards the heart of the structure. The low red lighting cast long shadows, and the occasional clank of a pipe or the thrum of a power line kept Gravis alert and ready.
The place seems deserted, Sergeant.
But as they turned a dogleg in the passageway, it became instantly clear that it was not. They had come upon a bulkhead that had been dropped across the corridor, blocking their way. One of the safety barriers that locked into place during a shutdown. Gravis had considered turning back, finding an alternative route, but that meant doubling back, and worse, it meant wasting time. He consulted his auspex. Going through the bulkhead was the quickest way to the reactor. They were only a matter of meters away. Once they were through, they could set the reactor to overload and get out of there. They would have to break through by blasting it with bolter and shotgun fire. He was about to outline this plan to the others when he heard the distinctive tap-tap of something ringing out against the metal floor plates. He glanced at the others inquisitively, but was met with only blank stares. He hesitated, a cold sensation spreading across his chest. There it was again. Tap-tap. like the clicking of a claw. Gravis stiffened. His finely tuned senses could hear breathing now. A ragged, rasping breath. A hissing. Something drew a claw across a wall plate, scratching a loud warning. It was toying with them. He knew what it was. They'd been herded into a trap. Gravis turned to see not one but two gene-stealers appear at the far end of the corridor, their heads bobbing, their multiple viciously clawed arms tapping the walls menacingly as they approached. Wriggling probosces surrounded their mouths, and their eyes were blood-red and shone with a startling intelligence. They crept forward, taking their time with their cornered prey. The scouts formed a line, keeping their backs to the bulkhead.
Don't let them get close. Don't let them get anywhere near you.
He knew firsthand what this genus was capable of. Gravis squeezed the trigger of his bolt pistol, spraying the gene-stealers with shells. But the creatures were too fast. They pounced, launching themselves into the air, springing off the walls to land only centimeters away from Gravis and the others. Gravis's bolt pistol went spinning away down the corridor, wrenched from his grip by a glistening talon. Corbis squeezed off a series of shots, catching one of the gene-stealers across its left flank, slowing it for only a second. It whipped out its claw and pinned the scout by the throat, dragging him closer, its probosces writhing with anticipation.
No!
Gravis's chainsword roared to life. He would not let this happen again, and he would not fail his captain. He charged the nearest alien, swinging his chainsword in a wide arc, aiming to take its head off. The creature swiped at him with its claw, battering his blade to one side and sending Gravis sprawling to the ground. He wasn't staying down, however, and twisted quickly up onto one knee, forcing the chainsword up. The gene-stealer's claw came down centimeters from his head, but clattered uselessly to the ground as Gravis's blade tore through the beast's carapace, chewing out its belly. It squirmed and thrashed, but Gravis pressed the blade home even harder, swiveling it round to maximize the damage. He stood, grabbing a fistful of the quivering mouth tentacles, yanking the creature's head to one side. The alien's claws raked his chest plate as it tried to pull itself free, but Gravis was lost to his rage. He left the chainsword buried in its innards and reached for his combat knife. He looked deep into the creature's eyes as he buried the knife to the hilt in its exposed throat. That's for Erinis. The gene-stealer squirmed once in his grasp, and then fell still. Gravis dropped the corpse to the floor. Beside him, the other gene-stealer still had Corbis pinned by the throat, but was also grappling with Tyrus, who had managed to draw his combat knife and was busy stabbing away at the creature's chitinous armor plating. He was bleeding freely from a long wound in his arm. Gravis calmly pulled his chainsword free of the corpse at his feet, stepped across the corridor, and wordlessly lopped off the head of the occupied gene-stealer. It fell to the metal floor with a dull thunk, and the body went limp. Corbis and Tyrus both disentangled themselves from the mass of limbs. Tyrus was breathing heavily.
I told you not to let it get too close to you.
Corbis laughed grimly.
What now?
Gravis motioned to the bulkhead.
Through there. The reactor is on the other side of this barricade. Corbis, see if you can blast through with your shotgun.
He stepped back to make room for the other scout.
And be quick. I don't want to be cornered by any more of these things.
He kicked at the dead remains of the nearest gene-stealer and moved off in search of his bolt pistol. The shotgun soon punched a series of irregular holes in the metal plating, causing the steel to splinter like rotten wood. Gravis kept watch, keen to avoid another encounter with the gene-stealers that were likely haunting the corridors around them, drawn in by the sounds of the battle. Presently, however, the bulkhead issued a long groan, and a large section of plating dropped away, clanging loudly where it fell. Corbis called him over. Gravis approached the makeshift door, his bolt pistol clutched in his fist. He could see little through the hatch, a bank of winking diodes and controls. The reactor room. He dipped his head and pulled himself through the opening. And that's when he saw it. The biggest tyrannid biomorph he had ever seen, squatting inside the reactor room. Its enormous dripping maw bared in what he could only imagine was a wicked smile. Corin thrust and cut, parried and spun, a riotous dance of destruction. He could barely see for the blood spray hanging in the air all around him. He was injured, but was choosing to ignore the warning sigils that flashed up inside his helm, alerting him to the deep gash in his thigh. Analgesics had already flooded the area, and his body would have time to repair itself later, if he survived. Many of his brothers were dead. He knew that instinctively. He had no need to witness the sorry ranks of the lost, the discarded bodies ripped apart by uncompromising alien jaws. He knew it, and it filled his heart with sadness. The Raven Guard were few, and they could ill afford to sacrifice themselves. But his brothers had died with purpose. They had died in the glory of battle, holding the Tyrannid army at bay while their brethren engineered the means of their victory. He only hoped that Gravis was close to achieving his goal. They could not hold out for much longer. Corin could see the Hive Tyrant was growing restless. The end was in sight, one way or another. Gravis eyed the creature warily. It was huge, towering at least 3 times his height, with a flared crest of blood-red chitin atop its massive head. Its lower jaw was wide and pink, splayed like a shovel and connected to 2 mandibles that twitched ominously from side to side as it regarded him. Its fangs were as big as his forearms and coated in dripping venom. Its body was long and snake-like, and, Gravis realized, disappeared into the ground, from where the monster had evidently burrowed its way into the generatorium, digging its way in from beneath the city. 3 huge pairs of limbs terminated in scything talons, with 2 sets of smaller arms bursting out from its chest. The creature emitted a shrill chirp and shifted its bulk, lowering its head to show them its fangs. Its fetid breath smelled of moist earth and decay. It filled the reactor room utterly. But no matter how hard it tried, it couldn't twist itself around enough to reach the Space Marines with its talons. Once again, Gravis was taken aback by the intelligence displayed by the Xenos. Had they known the scouts were coming? Was that why the biomorph had burrowed its way here? Or worse, had they planned to use the same trick? Were the Tyrannids actually intending to use the power station for the same purpose as the captain? To detonate it at a time when it would prove most devastating to the Imperial forces? Either way, they had been outmaneuvered. What is it? Corbus was standing beside him, staring up at the monstrous thing. It's between us and the reactor. Tyrus stepped forward, brandishing his combat knife. We're going to have to fight our way through. The scout was right. There was little else they could do. Corbus, get to that reactor. Tyrus and I will keep it occupied. Gravis raised his bolt pistol. We don't have to kill it, Tyrus. Just keep it busy. The reactor will do our job for us if we can get to it. Tyrus nodded, but Gravis wasn't clear whether it was an understanding or something else entirely. The injured scout seemed distant, distracted. Corbus approached the creature tentatively, trying to search out a route to the reactor. He moved left, and it howled like a baying wolf, slamming its talons down into the churned earth, trying its best to reach him. The bony blade scratched the walls in frustration. Corbus fell back, raising his shotgun and loosing a handful of shots. They tore its flesh, but did little more than anger it. Tyrus drew his combat knife. He extended his arm and placed something in Gravis's hand. It was a tiny bundle of bird skulls. Honor me, Sergeant, in the fields of Kievar. Tyrus! The scout charged forward towards the beast, his bolt pistol flaring as he fired round after round into the creature's open maw. It screeched in fury and lashed out with its scything talons, one of them catching him full in the chest, bursting out of his back and spattering Astartes' blood across the room. Tyrus growled in agony as he was lifted fully from the ground. His combat knife stabbed down, biting deep into the monster's flesh as it pulled him closer to its slavering jaws. Corbus, get to that reactor now! Gravis swung his bolt pistol around and fired into the alien's wide mouth, satisfied to see the bolter rounds flashing inside its head as they exploded brightly, cracking its teeth. The creature reared its head and thrashed alarmingly, swinging Tyrus violently from side to side. Tyrus was still alive, barely, speared on its outstretched claw. With one hand, he was firing his bolt pistol into its face. With the other, he was driving his combat knife repeatedly into the thick hide of its torso, searching for any vital organs. Gravis moved back and forth in a wide semicircle, keeping his weapon trained on the monster, firing clip after clip at its head, desperate to keep it from realizing that Corbus had now passed it, and was working on the reactor controls behind it. He reappeared a moment later, scrambling towards Gravis. Too late, Gravis saw the arcing talon as it swung down from above, catching Corbus square between the shoulders and pitching him forward. The scout stumbled and dropped. The talon raised again, ready to finish the prone Corbus. Gravis dived forward, grabbing at his brother and flinging him across the reactor room. The talon sliced down, puncturing his shoulder and opening his chest, bursting a lung. Gravis slumped to the floor. The world was spinning. The creature pulled Tyrus's now unconscious body towards its mouth and chewed off his head. Behind it, the reactor was reaching critical, warning sirens blaring. Gravis saw only darkness. Corin heard the explosion from almost 2 kilometers away. Even above the clamor of the raging battle, even above the screams of the dying aliens and the screeching of their claws across his power armor. He heard it, and he knew the Raven Guard were victorious. The ground rumbled and groaned, knocking him from his feet. He heard the vox bead buzz in his ear, but made no sense of the words as, all of a sudden, the planet seemed to lurch violently to one side. He heard a sound like rending stone, and scrambled to his knees in time to see the city walls give way, crumbling to the ground as titanic forces rent the earth apart. All around him, the Tyranids were scrabbling for solid ground, their animal minds unable to comprehend what was happening. Corin caught sight of the hive tyrant, its head thrust back, bellowing insanely at the sky. He watched as the ground cracked open beneath it, sucking the creature down into its rocky depths, pulling it into the canyon opened by Gravis's destruction of the power station. It was as if the planet itself was enacting its revenge against these insidious invaders, swallowing them whole, crushing them with its immense power. The Raven Guard had executed their plan to precision. The fault line had opened right beneath the heart of the Tyranid army, exactly where the Space Marines had pinned it in place. Scores of aliens spilled into the newly opened crevasse like a tide, unable to prevent themselves from falling. Their screams were a violent cacophony, a tortured howl that Corin would never forget. That was the sound of triumph. That was the sound of the Emperor's might. Those aliens that still swarmed around Corin himself seemed suddenly to lose direction, their psychic link with the hive mind interrupted by the death of their tyrant. They pressed on with their attack, but they had lost their cohesion, their underlying purpose, and were now fighting on instinct alone. It would be a simple matter for the remaining Raven Guard forces to mop up what was left of the alien brood. Corin sliced another alien in two with his talons. He was covered in Xenos blood, and his leg wound was still causing warning sigils to flare incessantly inside his helm. He watched as a group of Hormagaunts turned and fled from an approaching assault squad, who showed no mercy, mowing down the retreating aliens with their bolt pistols. He turned to see Argus approaching from behind, striding across the battlefield towards him, his power armor rent open across the chest in a wide gash, his bolter hanging by his side. Clusters of corvia hung from his belt, signifying the losses his squad had sustained during the thick of the battle. The veteran stopped beside Corin, surveying the scene across the battlefield. After a moment, he spoke.
Faith, you said, Captain.
Corin nodded. His voice was subdued.
Faith?
Argus put his hand on Corin's pauldron.
That is most definitely our way.
Gravis sucked noisily at the air and winced at the lancing pain it caused in his chest. He peeled open his eyes. He was outside, slumped against a wall. The meteor storm had abated, and the sun was perforating the clouds. His mouth was full of gritty blood, and he was gripping something tightly in his fist. He glanced down. It was Tyrus's corvia. He allowed his hand to drop to his lap. He would take them back to Kievar, bury them in the soil from whence they came. Corbis was standing over him. When he saw Gravis was awake, his pale face cracked into a wide grin. Gravis spat blood.
Corbis, you should have left me.
Corbis didn't answer. Gravis stared over at the enormous cavity that had opened in the ground behind them. The power station had been completely subsumed. What remained of it after the explosion had slid noisily into the hungry earth, tumbling down into the depths of the fractured landmass. Its destruction had opened a canyon across the face of Idos like a long, puckered scar, a fault line stemming from the site of the explosion and stretching for kilometers in both directions. Much of the city had been swallowed in the ensuing devastation. And the biomorph, too, along with most of the Tyrannid brood. Corbis dropped to his haunches beside the wounded sergeant.
What now, Sergeant?
Gravis put his hand on Corbis's shoulder.
Now, brother. Now you may call yourself Astartes.
All right, once again, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Sorry, not tuning out. Tuning in here to a little paint show here we got going. So we'll build today. We got some Teu Fire Warriors done, the whole 10 squad. We still got to do the drones, add little bits and so on and so forth. But that will be a part 3-er. This is part 2 now of the Fire Warrior build. And again, we're still waiting on the smaller camera to get here, guys. So we're able to do some really good close-up of the builds and paints that I have going on here. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me today here on my little hobby adventure. We checked out the brand new White Dwarf issue 450 from Warhammer. Make sure you guys go check out the new episode of Warhammer TV. It's pretty good. It talks about the Las Vegas Open. But we got them done here pretty much, guys. Like I said, just some of the small bits to do, and we are complete. So once again, thank you guys for hanging out here at Ghetto Finger Paints. And the broadcast is now over. Love to have you guys subscribe. Check us out at our Twitter account, guys. You can head over there, look up Ghetto Finger Paints on Twitter, and give us a follow. Anyway, have a great afternoon, guys.